They said his land was cursed. They laughed at his broken English and his calloused hands. For 37 years, the people of Millbrook Ridge mocked the quiet Mexican immigrant who worked alone under the relentless Texas sun, tending fields that looked more like graveyards than gardens. They called him the fool with the dead dirt. But on a storm-ravaged night in March 2019, when lightning split the earth and rain carved deep wounds into his property, construction workers preparing to bulldoze his land made a discovery that would shatter everything this town believed about success, worth, and the immigrant they had spent decades despising. What they found beneath those dry fields wasn't just shocking, it was impossible. And the man they had mocked, the man they said would die a failure, had spent nearly 4 decades protecting a secret so profound that even now, 5 years after his death, archaeologists, historians, and the FBI are still trying to understand what he knew, how he knew it, and why he sacrificed everything to keep it hidden. Before we dive into this story that will change how you see the silent people around you, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, and what you think could be worth guarding for an entire lifetime. This is not just a story about one man. This is about how we measure human value, about what we miss when we judge people by their accent instead of their actions, and about the devastating cost of prejudice. What happened in Millbrook Ridge forced an entire community to confront an unbearable truth. They had spent 37 years tormenting a guardian, and by the time they discovered what he was protecting, it was too late to say they were sorry. The man's name was Mateo Ruiz Sandoval. And this is the story of how the immigrant America laughed at became the man America will never forget. Mateo arrived in Millbrook Ridge, Texas in 1982, crossing the border with nothing but a canvas bag, $43, and a photograph of his grandfather he kept folded in his pocket. He was 24 years old. He spoke almost no English. He had no family in America, no connections, no promises of work. What he did have was a degree in archaeology from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, a photographic memory and knowledge of pre-Columbian civilizations that would have impressed scholars at any institution in the world. But his degree meant nothing here. His expertise was invisible. To the people of Millbrook Ridge, he was just another illegal looking for handouts, another burden on a town already struggling with its own economic decline. Mateo found work doing what immigrants do, the jobs no one else wants. He picked pecans in the fall, cleaned horse stables in the winter, did landscaping in the spring. He saved every dollar, lived in a tool shed behind a mechanic's garage, ate 1 meal a day. The townspeople barely noticed him except to complain about his presence. But Mateo was watching. He was studying. And in 1985, when old Harold Thornton died, and his 60-acre property went up for auction because no heirs could be found, Mateo did something that shocked the entire town. He bought it. He walked into the county assessor's office with 3 years of savings, $18,000 in cash, rubber-banded and sorted, and purchased the most desolate, unforgiving piece of land in the entire county. The land was a joke. Everyone knew it. The soil was rocky and alkaline, cursed by decades of failed crops. Harold Thornton himself had gone bankrupt trying to make anything grow there. Water wouldn't hold. Seeds wouldn't take. The few trees that existed were twisted and dying. When word spread that the Mexican laborer had bought Thornton's wasteland, the town erupted in cruel laughter. At the feed store, at the diner, at Sunday services, the jokes were relentless. "Give it 6 months," they said. "He'll be begging someone to take it off his hands." But Mateo didn't beg. He didn't complain. He didn't explain. He simply moved onto that land with his canvas bag and his photograph, built a small wooden shack with his own hands, and began to work. But here's what made the townspeople turn from amusement to contempt. Mateo didn't farm the way anyone expected. He didn't plant in neat rows. He didn't use modern equipment. He dug. He spent months, then years, excavating strange patterns across his property, moving earth in ways that made no agricultural sense. He created shallow trenches that zigzagged across fields, carved peculiar circular indentations into hillsides, and built low stone walls that seemed to serve no purpose. Neighbors who drove past his property would shake their heads in disgust. "He's digging holes like a dog," they'd say. "Doesn't know the first thing about farming." The mockery intensified when his first attempts at crops failed spectacularly. Corn withered before it reached knee height. Tomatoes rotted on the vine. Nothing thrived. 2. Everyone watching. Mateo Sandoval was exactly what they had always believed him to be. An ignorant immigrant, in over his head, destined to fail. But Mateo kept digging. and the town's amusement curdled into active hostility, led by three people who would become the architects of his suffering. First, there was Richard Caldwell, the president of Millbrook Ridge's town council and the owner of the largest commercial farm in the county. Richard represented old Texas money, fourth generation, wealth, and he saw Mateo's presence as an insult to everything the town stood for. To Richard, Mateo was a symbol of American decline, of borders that didn't hold, of standards that didn't matter. Second, there was Patricia Vance, the principal of Millbrook Ridge High School and self-appointed guardian of the town's moral character. Patricia spoke about Christian values every Sunday at First Baptist, but her charity never extended to people who looked like Mateo. She organized committees, led campaigns, and made sure everyone knew that immigrants were the reason property values were falling and why good families were leaving town. And third, there was Jake Morrison, a younger man, bitter and angry, who had inherited his father's struggling farm and needed someone to blame for his own failures. Jake saw Mateo's exotic digging patterns and strange land use as a personal mockery, a taunt from an outsider who didn't deserve to own land in America at all. These three became the faces of Mateo's persecution, but they represented something larger, an entire community's willingness to despise what they didn't understand. The confrontations began small. Richard Caldwell started it in 1987, 2 years after Mateo bought the land, showing up at a town council meeting with a formal complaint. "That property is being mismanaged," Richard announced to the council, his voice dripping with righteous authority. "It's an eyesore. It's dragging down surrounding property values, and frankly, I question whether Mr. Sandoval even has legal right to that land. I'm calling for an investigation into his immigration status and a potential eminent domain action if he can't prove he's using the property productively." The council murmured its agreement. Mateo wasn't there to defend himself. He had no idea the meeting was even happening. But when the county inspector showed up at Mateo's property the following week, flanked by Richard Caldwell and armed with clipboards and legal documents, Mateo was ready. He met them at the gate, dusty and sun-worn, his English still halting but his dignity absolute. "This is private property," Mateo said quietly, his dark eyes meeting Richard's cold blue stare. "You need warrant to come here." Richard's face flushed red. "Listen to me very carefully," Richard said, stepping closer, his voice low and threatening. "You don't get to tell me what I need. This is my town. My family built this county. You're nothing but a squatter on land you have no business owning. Now you can let us inspect your property voluntarily, or we can get the sheriff down here and do this the hard way. Your choice, amigo." The condescension in that last word, amigo, dripped with contempt. But Mateo didn't flinch. "You come back with warrant," he repeated, his voice calm but immovable. "Until then, you leave." The inspector, uncomfortable with the confrontation, suggested they return with proper paperwork. Richard stormed off, humiliated, and from that day forward, he made Mateo's destruction his personal mission. The harassment escalated. Patricia Vance weaponized the school system, launching a community campaign about preserving Millbrook Ridge's heritage. She wrote editorials for the local paper about how certain elements were changing the character of our town, never mentioning Mateo by name but making sure everyone knew exactly who she meant. She organized parent meetings where she presented statistics, manipulated and misleading, about how property crimes had increased since the immigrant population had arrived. When confronted by the few voices who dared defend Mateo, Patricia would clutch her chest and insist she harbored no prejudice, that she simply cared about safety and community standards. But her husband owned the only hardware store in town, and mysteriously Mateo found himself unable to buy supplies there. "We're out of stock," they'd tell him, even as the shelves gleamed with inventory. "Try somewhere else, Jake." Morrison took a more direct approach. He began driving his truck past Mateo's property at night, headlights blazing, horn blaring, screaming insults in English he knew Mateo barely understood. Sometimes he'd throw beer bottles over the fence. Twice he cut Mateo's water line, forcing the older man to spend days repairing the damage in 100-degree heat. And on one particularly cruel afternoon in 1993, Jake organized a group of young men from the high school, football players looking for entertainment, to vandalize Mateo's property, spray painting slurs on his shack, trampling his meager crops, destroying months of work. When Mateo went to the sheriff, he was met with bureaucratic indifference. "Did you see who did it?" the deputy asked. "Do you have proof? Evidence?" Mateo had none. The case went nowhere. The message was clear. In Millbrook Ridge, Mateo Sandoval had no protection, no recourse, no voice. Years passed like this. 1995, 2000, 2005. Mateo aged under the weight of relentless hostility. But something remarkable happened. He never stopped working. He never fought back with anger. He simply continued his strange excavations, his peculiar patterns, his inexplicable movements of earth. His crops continued to fail, but he didn't seem bothered by this. He lived modestly, worked construction jobs in neighboring towns to earn money, and poured every free hour into his land. Neighbors who watched him became increasingly unsettled. There was something unnerving about his calm, about his refusal to break, about the way he looked at his land with such profound reverence, as if he were guarding something sacred. "He's hiding something," people began to whisper. "Probably drugs," Jake Morrison insisted at the bar. "Mexican cartel money buried out there. That's why he won't let anyone on his property." The whispers reached fever pitch in 2011 when Mateo did something that seemed to confirm everyone's darkest suspicions. He built a fence. Not just any fence, a serious, imposing 8-foot barrier that ringed his entire 60-acre property, with locks, chains, and multiple no trespassing signs posted in both English and Spanish. The town exploded with outrage. Richard Caldwell called an emergency town council meeting. "This proves it," Richard declared, slamming his hand on the table for emphasis. "That man is involved in criminal activity. No innocent person needs that kind of security. I'm calling for a full investigation. County, state, federal if necessary. We need to know what he's hiding, and we need to know now." The council voted unanimously to request a property inspection, citing credible concerns about illicit activity. When the notice arrived at Mateo's property, hand-delivered by a sheriff's deputy, Mateo read it slowly, his weathered face betraying no emotion. Then he did something that shocked the deputy. He invited him in. "You want to see my land?" Mateo asked in his accented but increasingly confident English. "I show you. I show everyone. But first, you tell me, why you think I am criminal? What crime I commit?" The deputy, a younger man named Ray Henderson, who had always felt uncomfortable with how Mateo was treated, shifted his weight awkwardly. "Mr. Sandoval, I'm just doing my job. There's been concerns about your property, about what you might be doing here." Mateo studied him for a long moment, and then he said something that would haunt Ray Henderson for the rest of his life. "You know what I am doing here? I am remembering. I am protecting. I am keeping safe what your people forgot. And one day, when truth comes, you will understand why I could never leave, why I could never stop. But I don't think that day is today." He opened the gate. "Come. Look. You will find nothing you expect." Ray and the county inspector spent 3 hours walking Mateo's property that afternoon. They found no drugs, no weapons, no evidence of any criminal activity. What they found confused them even more. The strange excavations, the peculiar patterns, the careful stonework that seemed to serve no purpose, and everywhere, journals. Mateo had filled hundreds of notebooks with drawings, measurements, calculations, and notes written in Spanish that neither man could read. The excavations themselves were fascinating, methodical, precise, clearly the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, even if no one else could understand why. When they filed their report, they had to conclude there was no criminal activity, but the report also noted, property owner's land use remains highly unusual, and his explanations inadequate. Recommend continued monitoring. It was enough to keep the harassment alive. But the final confrontation, the one that would change everything, came in the spring of 2014, when Richard Caldwell assembled a coalition of property owners to launch a lawsuit against Mateo, claiming his misuse of land was depressing surrounding property values and demanding compensation. The lawsuit was a thinly veiled attempt to force Mateo into bankruptcy, to make him lose the land he couldn't afford to fight for in court. The case went before Judge Martha Crawford in county court, and on a sweltering May afternoon, Mateo Sandoval, now 56 years old, his hair graying, his hands gnarled from decades of labor, stood alone before a courtroom packed with hostile faces, representing himself because he couldn't afford a lawyer. Richard Caldwell's attorney, a slick Austin lawyer named Bryce Hamilton, delivered a devastating opening statement. He presented aerial photographs of Mateo's property, pointing out the chaotic excavations, the failed crops, the eyesore that had plagued the community for nearly 30 years. He called witnesses. Patricia Vance testified tearfully about how property values had plummeted, how families had left town, how the community's reputation had suffered. Jake Morrison, wearing his cleanest shirt and his most earnest expression, described how Mateo's suspicious behavior had made neighbors feel unsafe, had created an atmosphere of fear. The testimonies were coordinated, rehearsed, and devastating. When Bryce Hamilton finished, he turned to Mateo with theatrical contempt and asked the question designed to destroy him. Mr. Sandoval, can you explain to this court, in clear, understandable terms, what possible legitimate purpose your bizarre excavations serve? Can you provide any evidence that your land use is anything other than the incompetent fumbling of a man who has no business owning property in this country? The courtroom went silent. Every eye turned to Mateo. He stood slowly, his worn hands resting on the defendant's table. And for several seconds he said nothing. The silence stretched, became uncomfortable. People shifted in their seats. Judge Crawford leaned forward. Mr. Sandoval, do you have a response? And then Mateo spoke. His voice quiet but clear. His English now. Nearly perfect after 3 decades of listening, learning, practicing. Yes, Your Honor, I have response. But first I have question for Mr. Caldwell and for all the people in this room who have spent 30 years calling me fool, calling me criminal, calling me burden on their town. He turned to face the packed courtroom, his dark eyes moving slowly across the hostile faces. My question is simple. How many of you know what this land was before it became Texas? How many of you know what people lived here? What civilizations rose and fell on this soil? What was built and destroyed and buried before your ancestors ever arrived? Do you know? Do any of you know? The question hung in the air. Bizarre and unexpected. Richard Caldwell laughed nervously. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. We're not here for a history lesson from... But Judge Crawford raised her hand. Let him speak. Mr. Sandoval, please continue. Mateo nodded slowly. When I came to this land in 1985, I came because I recognized it. Not because I had been here before, but because I had studied it. In Mexico, at university, I specialized in pre-Columbian archaeology of the American Southwest. My grandfather was Aztec descendant, a keeper of oral histories that went back centuries. He told me stories of great migrations, of sacred sites, of places where our ancestors buried their most precious treasures when Spanish conquistadors came. He showed me maps passed down through generations, maps that showed places of power, places of memory, places that must be protected. He pulled from his worn jacket a plastic sleeve containing a photograph, old, faded, carefully preserved. He held it up so the court could see. It showed a young boy standing next to an elderly man, both brown-skinned, both smiling, mountains in the background. This is my grandfather, Rodrigo Sandoval. He died when I was 18 years old. His last words to me were, Mateo, you must go north. You must find the place where the rivers meet, where the rocks rise like pyramids, where our ancestors left what they could not carry. You must become its guardian. Promise me. I promised him. And when I arrived in Texas and I heard about land for sale in Millbrook Ridge, I studied the geological surveys. I studied the terrain. I studied the old Spanish maps in Austin's archives. And I knew this was the place my grandfather described. The courtroom had gone completely still. Even Richard Caldwell had stopped smiling. Mateo continued, his voice gaining strength. I bought this land not to farm. I bought it to protect. Because beneath those 60 acres, beneath the soil you call cursed and worthless, there is something that belongs to history. For 30 years I have been carefully excavating, documenting, and preserving a pre-Columbian site of immense archaeological significance. I found pottery shards from the Caddo people dating back over 800 years. I found stone tools from Paleo-Indian cultures that existed 10,000 years before Christ. I found ceremonial burial grounds that contain artifacts your museums would kill to possess. And deeper, much deeper, in the cave system that runs beneath the southern section of the property, I found sealed chambers that contained offerings, relics, and objects that predate any civilization we have catalogued in this region. He reached into his jacket again and pulled out a small leather-bound journal, its pages thick with notes and drawings. Everything I have found, I have documented. Every artifact, every bone, every piece of pottery. I have spent 3 decades working alone because I knew that if anyone learned what was here, it would be destroyed. It would be looted. It would be sold to collectors or locked in storage rooms. My people's history would be stolen again. So I worked in silence. I accepted your mockery, your hatred, your violence, because the alternative was betrayal. Betrayal of my grandfather. Betrayal of my ancestors. Betrayal of history itself. Judge Crawford looked stunned. Mr. Sandoval, are you saying there are actual archaeological remains on your property? Significant remains? Mateo nodded. Yes, Your Honor. But I could never report them. You understand why? The moment I report them, I lose control. The universities come. The government comes. They dig up everything, they take everything, and my people's history becomes property of institutions that have never respected us. So I became the guardian. I protected what they left behind. And I have been waiting. Waiting for the right time. Waiting until I was too old to continue alone. Waiting to find people I could trust. His eyes moved across the courtroom, settling on Richard Caldwell. But I never imagined the people of this town would spend 30 years trying to destroy me for doing what they should have thanked me for. Preserving their history too. The revelation was so unexpected, so completely outside anyone's framework for understanding Mateo that for several seconds no one knew how to respond. Then Richard Caldwell stood, his face red with anger and something that looked like fear. This is insane. Your Honor, this man is clearly delusional. He's spinning fairy tales to avoid accountability. Pre-Columbian relics in Millbrook Ridge, buried treasure, this is fantasy. But even as Richard spoke, something in his voice had changed. The absolute certainty was gone, replaced by defensive aggression. Because everyone in that courtroom was now wondering the same thing. What if he's telling the truth? Judge Crawford made a decision that would alter everything. I'm ordering a temporary halt to these proceedings. Mr. Sandoval, I'm going to request that the Texas Historical Commission send archaeologists to examine your property. If what you're saying is true, this court needs expert verification before any judgment can be made. Mateo closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, they glistened. Thank you, Your Honor. But I have one request. When they come, I want to show them something first. Something I have never shown anyone. Because if I am to lose my role as guardian, then the whole truth must be told. 3 weeks later, on a June morning, a team from the Texas Historical Commission arrived at Mateo's property, accompanied by Judge Crawford, a court recorder, and, because Richard Caldwell insisted, several town council members, including Richard himself, Patricia Vance, and Jake Morrison. They came expecting to find nothing, to confirm Mateo's delusion. What they found instead would make national news and rewrite the archaeological history of the American Southwest. Mateo led them through his property, pointing out excavation sites, showing them carefully preserved artifacts stored in labeled boxes in his shack, pottery, tools, decorative objects, each meticulously catalogued in his journals with precise location data and sketches. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Sarah Chen from the University of Texas, examined the items with increasing astonishment. Mr. Sandoval, this is extraordinary. Some of these pieces could be 800–900 years old. The documentation is actually excellent. Better than some professional digs I've seen. But you said there was more? Mateo nodded. The cave system. I will show you. He led them to the southern edge of his property, to an area that looked like a natural hillside. But when Mateo removed a carefully camouflaged wooden panel, it revealed a stone entrance. Ancient, deliberately constructed, clearly not natural. He lit a gas lantern and began descending rough-hewn steps into the earth. The group followed in stunned silence. The tunnel opened into a chamber, small at first, then expanding into a space perhaps 30 feet across. And there, illuminated by Mateo's lantern and the archaeologists' flashlights, they saw it. Walls covered in petroglyphs, some familiar from known Caddo sites, but others in styles no one recognized. Stone altars still holding traces of ancient offerings. And in alcoves carved into the rock walls, sealed with carefully stacked stones, were bundles wrapped in deteriorated cloth. Mateo carefully removed one of the stone seals. He had clearly done this before. And gently extracted a wrapped bundle. He brought it to Dr. Chen. You open it. You are the witness now. Dr. Chen's hands shook as she carefully unwrapped the ancient cloth. Inside was a copper mask, elaborately engraved, its patina suggesting extreme age. My God, she whispered. This is pre-Columbian, possibly pre-Caddo. This is significant beyond anything I can tell you right now. She looked at Mateo with something close to reverence. Mr. Sandoval, you've been protecting a major archaeological site, possibly one of the most significant in Texas, completely alone, for 30 years? Mateo nodded slowly. I had no choice. I made promise to my grandfather. I keep my promises. Richard Caldwell, standing in that ancient chamber, his polished boots covered in dust, his certainty shattered, looked around in disbelief. Patricia Vance was crying. Whether from shame or shock, no one could tell. Jake Morrison had gone pale. His arrogant posture collapsed into something small and hunched. The transformation was visceral. In that moment, 30 years of cruelty, of mockery, of casual hatred came crashing down on all of them with unbearable weight. Everything they had believed about Mateo, that he was ignorant, incompetent, worthless, a burden, had been catastrophically wrong. And they had been so cruel. So endlessly, thoughtlessly cruel. Dr. Chen spent the next 4 hours documenting the site with her team, while Mateo answered questions with the precision of a trained professional, which of course he was. He showed them his journals, years of documentation, theories, sketches, measurements. He explained how he'd identified the site, how he'd carefully excavated without disturbing. Context, how he'd preserved everything in situ except for items he'd feared might deteriorate with exposure. When Dr. Chen finally emerged from the cave, she immediately called her department head. The conversation was brief and intense. When she hung up, she turned to Mateo. "Mr. Sandoval, I need you to understand something. What you've discovered here is going to change how we understand pre-Columbian cultures in this region. The university wants to partner with you, with your permission, to conduct a proper excavation. There's grant money, resources, proper equipment. But more than that, sir, they want to hire you. Your expertise, your knowledge of this site, you're irreplaceable." The words hung in the air. Irreplaceable. Mateo Sandoval, the man they called worthless, was irreplaceable. Richard Caldwell, who had spent 30 years trying to destroy this man, felt something inside him break. He stepped forward, his voice cracking. "Mr. Sandoval, I have no words. What we did to you, what I did to you." He couldn't finish. The magnitude of his cruelty, faced with Mateo's quiet dignity and staggering sacrifice, was too much to bear. Patricia Vance was openly sobbing now. "We were monsters to you," she whispered. "All these years. And we were just monsters." Jake Morrison stood apart from the group, his face a mask of shame so profound he looked physically ill. Mateo looked at them, these people who had tormented him for decades, and his expression held no triumph, no vindication, just an exhausted sadness. "You judged what you did not understand," he said quietly. "You saw Immigrant with bad English and dirty hands, and you decided you knew everything about me. You decided my worth. But you never asked why I was here. You never asked what I knew. You never tried to see past what I looked like, how I spoke. You just wanted me gone." The truth of his words settled over the group like ash. No one could meet his eyes. But then Mateo did something that no one expected. He walked to Richard Caldwell and extended his hand. "I accept your apology, Mr. Caldwell. Not because you deserve my forgiveness, but because hatred is burden I cannot carry anymore. I am 66 years old. I am tired. My work here is almost finished. I can give it to people who will respect it now. And I don't want to die with anger in my heart. So yes, I forgive you. All of you. But you must understand, my forgiveness does not erase what you did. It does not fix what you broke. You must carry that. You must learn from it. You must become different people." Richard took his hand, tears streaming down his face, unable to speak. Patricia approached next, her voice barely audible. "Is there anything at all, we can do to make this right?" Mateo considered this. "You can tell truth. You can tell this town what you learned today. You can teach your children not to measure human worth by appearance, by accent, by what seems like failure on the surface. You can remember that the person you mock, the immigrant you dismiss, might be carrying knowledge you cannot imagine, protecting something you do not deserve. That is how you make it right." The news of the discovery spread quickly. Within days, Millbrook Ridge was swarmed with media, archaeologists, and historical preservationists. Mateo's land became a protected historical site. The University of Texas offered him a research position with full salary and benefits. The Mexican government sent a delegation to honor him for preserving indigenous heritage. And slowly, painfully, the town of Millbrook Ridge had to confront what it had done. Richard Caldwell used his wealth and influence to establish a scholarship fund for immigrant students pursuing archaeology and history, naming it the Rodrigo and Mateo Sandoval Fellowship. He resigned from the town council and spent his remaining years advocating for immigrant rights, speaking publicly about his own transformation, never shying away from admitting what he had been. Patricia Vance revised the school curriculum to include mandatory units on local indigenous history and the contributions of immigrant communities. She brought Mateo into classrooms to speak, where he gently taught children the lessons their parents had refused to learn. Jake Morrison struggled the most. His shame was so profound he could barely function. It was Mateo who reached out to him, who offered him work helping with the excavation, who taught him about the land they both lived on. Jake would never be the same. His arrogance was gone, replaced by a humility that looked like permanent sorrow. Mateo lived 4 more years after the discovery, working alongside teams of archaeologists, seeing his life's work validated and preserved. He died peacefully in 2018, at the age of 70, in a hospital room surrounded by people who had finally learned to see him truly. The town of Millbrook Ridge held a memorial service that filled the high school gymnasium. Richard Caldwell gave the eulogy, his voice shaking as he told the truth. "We spent 30 years trying to destroy a man who was better than all of us. We judged him. We mocked him. We tried to break him. And he responded with grace we didn't deserve, with forgiveness we didn't earn, and with a dignity we couldn't understand." Mateo Sandoval was a guardian of history, a keeper of promises, and a teacher of the hardest lesson, that our prejudice blinds us to the sacred, and our arrogance causes us to destroy what we should protect. The archaeological site continues to yield discoveries. The artifacts Mateo preserved are now in museums, properly contextualized, honoring the cultures that created them. And his story, the story of the immigrant who was mocked for his broken English and his dirty hands, who worked alone for 30 years protecting treasures beneath cursed earth, has become a parable that spreads far beyond Millbrook Ridge. It's a story about what we miss when we judge people by what they seem to be rather than who they are. It's a story about the devastating cost of prejudice and the profound power of one person's commitment to something larger than themselves. It's a story about humility, real humility, which is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less, and putting your purpose above your pride. Mateo Sandoval buried nothing beneath his fields. He protected what was already there, what had been waiting for centuries for someone to care enough to keep it safe. And in doing so, he revealed what was buried in the hearts of his neighbors, the ugliness of their judgment, and eventually, through unbearable confrontation with their own cruelty, the possibility of their redemption. Not everyone can be saved, but Mateo proved that everyone can be offered grace, and that grace, unearned, undeserved, freely given, has the power to transform even those who least deserve it. If this story moved you, if it made you reconsider how you judge the people around you, I need you to do something. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, and drop a comment below telling me about a time you judged someone unfairly and what you learned from it. And subscribe to this channel because stories like Mateo's, stories that challenge us, that change us, that remind us what it means to be human, are what we're all about here. The people we dismiss might be the ones who have the most to teach us. Remember that. Remember Mateo, and remember that beneath the surface of everyone you meet, there might be something sacred worth protecting.